Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining Metropolitan Community College's Women's History Month event this evening. This event is actually a part of our Diversity Matters film and lecture series. My name is Dr. Cynthia Gooch Grayson, and it is my honor as the Associate Vice President for Access, Opportunity, and TRIO programs to welcome you to the college's annual celebration recognition of Women's History Month. The origins of Women's History Month dates back to 1978 in Santa Rosa, California, when the Education Task Force of Sonoma County Commission on the Status of Women planned a Women's History Week celebration during the week of March 8th to correspond with International Women's Day. In 1987, after being petitioned by the National Women's History Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to honoring and preserving women's history, proclaimed March 1987 as Women's History Month. Since 1988, Congress and the presidents have annually issued resolutions and proclamations declaring March as Women's History Month. So, happy Women's History Month. Tonight, we will learn from an amazing speaker and celebrate her as well as works of Rebecca Hall. Dr. Jeannette Eileen Jones-Fazansky is the Carl A. Happold Associate Professor of History and Ethnic Studies and Director of the 19th Century Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She is also program faculty in African and African American Studies and Women's and Gender Studies. Dr. Jones earned her bachelor's degree in history from Hofstra University in New York and her master's and MA and Ph.D. in history from the University of Buffalo. She is a historian of the United States with expertise in American cultural and intellectual history, African American studies, pre-colonial African history, U.S. and the world, and digital humanities. She is the author of In Search of Brightest Africa, Reimagining the Dark Continent in American Culture, 1884 to 1936, the University of Georgia Press, 2010. She is currently working on her second monograph, America in Africa, U.S. Empire, Race, and the African Question, 1821 to 1919, which is under advanced contract with Yale University Press. She is a co-principal investigator on the digital project To Enter Africa from America, the United States, Africa, and the New Imperialism, 1962 to 1919, and also co-PI for the Mellon Foundation funded project U.S. Law and Race Initiative. She is widely published and the recipient of countless awards and recognition for her scholarly work and her civic engagement. After my brief introduction of the novel, the next voice you will hear is that of none other than Dr. Jeannette Eileen Jones-Fazansky. Part graphic novel, part memoir, Wake is an imaginative tour de force that tells the powerful story of women-led slave revolts and chronicles scholar Rebecca Hall's efforts to uncover the truth about these women warriors who until now have been left out of the historical record. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Dr. Jeannette Eileen Jones-Fazansky.
Good evening. Thank you, Dr. Gooch Grayson, for inviting me to give this talk today. And I want to thank Metropolitan Community College as well for their wonderful hospitality. As Dr. Gooch Grayson noted, Rebecca Hall has really done an important job and work in bringing these stories to the fore that many people did not know, and also doing it in a form that is very accessible to not only lay peoples or non-historians, but also to young adults. And so here's the book, if you have it. It is, as she said, part memoir, part graphic novel. So I want to tell you a little bit about Rebecca Hall. So she's an independent scholar, activist, and educator. She writes and publishes on the history of race, gender, law, and resistance, as well as publishes articles on climate justice and intersectional feminist theory. And if you read the book, you can see where her interest in the race, gender, and the law and resistance intersects with feminist theory and the way that she interprets the women who are part of these iconic slave revolts that happened mostly in the 18th century. Dr. Hall, or Professor Hall, has a J.D. from UC Berkeley School of Law and her Ph.D. in history from UC Santa Cruz. And if you want to learn more about her background, you can go to the Harvard website, where she was a fellow for the Radcliffe Institute. And so here, what you see is one of the pages from the book. And in fact, it is when she's sitting around thinking about what she's going to do for research. And she's having a conversation with herself, thinking about the archive and what's in the archive. For those of you who are not familiar, she has this book called Roll, Jordan, Roll. I remember reading this for my comprehensive exams, written by Eugene Genovese, The World the Slaves Made, and really trying to figure out why there are so few women in this actual account of slavery, right? And slave resistance. And she starts to look at all kinds of primary sources, and you see her depicted in the library in stacks in the archive. If you can see that in the upper right-hand corner, she has that perplexed look, like, how am I going to get through all these archives and find the stories that I'm looking for? She's also looking at the Lloyds of London's logs and other logs for the Royal African Company, which had kept meticulous records of their so-called slave ships. And so she's, again, trying to figure out, where are the Black women when there are instances of revolt and people are talking about that and chronicling them? Where are the women? And why are the women, not only are a lot of revolts being suppressed, but why is the knowledge of women's leadership and involvement in those revolts being suppressed in the historical record, or at least how historians have written about it? But through really a lot of sleuthing, she realizes that actually the women are there. It's just we need to read, and she says this in several pages, read between the lines, right? How do we figure out who's involved and who's leading, who's pushing forward these efforts to either revolt aboard the slave ship, and then later on we'll talk about revolts that took place in mainland North America. And so you see her there perplexed, reading these documents. Here she is one of, so let me just say that last, for page reference, if you want to read that whole section, that's page 10 through 11, and you'll get a sense of how she's unpacking that and what it means to be a historian and to journey in the archives and to read secondary sources to find the stories of these missing women. So instead of going through all of the pages, I just want to highlight some important events that are important to the narrative or crucial to the narrative. And one is Dom Regina versus the Negro slaves, which is chapter 2 of the book. And so she writes, historians, history written by the victors always erases resistance. And those of us who live in the wake, right, the ruins, learn that we are inferior. And she goes on in that we were destined to be enslaved. This is the afterlife of slavery that she talks about, right? That this idea that the victors have written the story, they've written the history, and in it they have justified the enslavement of Africans and their descendants. And so she's going up, as you can see, she's thinking about all of these stories and how someone who's a descendant of enslaved Africans and African Americans in the United States is trying to make sense of that, not only as a human being who's descendant of those people, but also as a scholar, as a historian. How do we face these obstacles? And she says, you know, I came here only to recover a history of resistance, but also to specifically find the women whose stories have been written out of slave revolts. And so here is one. She also has a learning tool online for, so if anyone's in K through 12, or even if you're teaching at the collegiate level, she has a site called the Ida B. Wells Education Project, where you can access documents that will help you teach these revolts. So here's a transcription. Dom Regina versus Abigail, a Negro woman slave of Ginsburg, Vandenberg. So these are the Dutch. Tom, a Negro man, slave of Rip Van Dam. So those are two Dutchmen. The jury being charged and sworn say upon their oath that the defendants, Abigail, a Negro woman, slave of Ginsburg, Vandenberg, and Tom, a Negro man, slave of Rip Van Dam, are guilty of the murder whereof they stand indicted, and that considered by the court, and that they have no goods or chattels, etc. Therefore, it is considered by the court that the defendants at the bar, Abigail the Negro, slave of Ginsburg, Vandenberg, and Tom, a Negro man, slave of Rip Van Dam, be carried from hence to the place from whence they came, and from thence to the place of execution, and there to be hanged by the necks until they're dead. And this source comes from the New York City Municipal Archives, one of the many archives that Rebecca Hall conducted research in. And this is one of the documents related to the New York City slave revolt of 1712. And it is an iconic revolt. Later on in 1741, there's a quote, rumor of revolt, but again, there's a synergy between these, that individuals have been brought to New York City, which was, according to Smithsonian, a major hub for the North American slave trade, with thousands of men, women, and children passing through the slave market that operated in the heart of what is now the financial district. So if you've been down to New York City, we're talking about Pearl Street, we're talking about Wall Street, where the harbor is. Ironically, the harbor where the Statue of Liberty is, that is the harbor through which they would bring enslaved African Americans, Africans, excuse me. And then they became African Americans when they were brought on to shore and through subsequent generations. So on the night of April 6th, 1712, all of the problems that the people who were enslaved, I mean, of course, they had always resisted slavery, but the inhumane treatment, the public displays of violence on their bodies came to a head, and they decided to lead a revolt in New York City. And they took up arms and revolted against their captors. Of course, it was not successful in terms of overthrowing the slave regime, but it was successful in that they got their point across, that they were not destined to be slaves. They did not want to be slaves. They did not ask to be slaves, and they would continue to resist slavery until their dying day. In the case of Tom and Abigail, until they were hung by their necks at the gallows. This is another important part of the story for those of you who are familiar with New York City. I think this happened. I remember that I was in graduate school, and there was going to be a building built downtown, and all of a sudden, bones were found. And if anyone knows anything about archaeology and public works, once there are bones or remains found, you have to cease any kind of building. And she recounts this in the book. And what happens is these archaeologists discover the burial ground. This is where they called it the African burial ground, where people who died in slavery in New York, whether they were born in Africa or born in New York City, were buried. And one of the important scenes in her novel, her graphic novel, is the burial of Akua, who is someone who led resistance in the city, but also who was considered to be a mother to a lot of the motherless enslaved women and men, and also someone who was a healer and what they called an obia woman. And so this scene shows you them coming together to mourn the loss of Akua. Another scene, I didn't show the burial scene, but this is the scene after. One mourner says, "I remember Akua. When everyone thought I was dying, Akua came to me and helped me push my son out. She stayed with me and used her strength to keep me from crossing over." Another mourner says, "I remember Akua, a mighty obia woman. She could make the crooked line straight. I might have been born in this land," meaning New York, meaning North America, "but Akua taught me the power of the ancestors, how I would be with them when I pass." And so Akua was a spiritual leader. She was an obia woman. She was also a midwife. She helped people give birth to their children, but she also kept them, even if they were removed from Africa because they were born in New York, she kept them understanding their relationship to Africa, to the ancestors that came before them. And here you see all the women and some men talking about the importance of Akua, but also thinking about Abigail, who has been sentenced to death as part of in the wake of the 1712 slave revolt. Another slave revolt that she talks about takes place on a ship. And this is the ship that they call the Unity. Now, if anyone knows anything about these slave owners and slave traders, they all, like a ship was named Jesus. Like they had all kinds of really interesting names, Compassion, Serenity, like and all the names that belied actually what was happening on these ships: systematic rapes of women, beating, starvation, and the like. And so there was a slave revolt on the ship Unity. And if you want to read more about this, it starts on page 160 of the graphic novel. And here you see her depicting what happened, the arrival of the ship called the Unity on the coast of Africa on October 30th, and then what happens aboard the ship as they set sail for the Americas. This image that I show you is actually the logbook from Captain Robert Norris. It's on the website for the National Museums of Liverpool. Liverpool was an important slave trading port in Great Britain. So this is from Robert Norris in his words. The voyage was eventful. The first revolt occurred on 6 June 1770, with the entry that, quote, the slaves made an insurrection which was soon quelled with the loss of 2 women slaves. Hint, those women slaves were part of that revolt, right? Again, she's trying to recover the voices of those women. And the deaths of 3 more enslaved women followed. So 5 enslaved women were involved in that revolt. And unfortunately, they lost their lives. But if you look at the novel, one of the things that was often said was that they would rather die in the sea than being brought over to the Americas and be enslaved. So sometimes they would literally fight to the death, and if they thought they were cornered, they would jump overboard. Next, on June 22nd, it is recorded that, quote, the slaves attempted another insurrection after the death of a girl slave, number 13, lost a man of Captain Henry Finney's purchase who jumped overboard and was drowned. So she jumped overboard. Employed securing the men in chains and gave the women concerned 24 lashes each. So the women who were part of this revolt and led this revolt, the one that did not die by jumping over, was punished. And all of those women received, quote, 24 lashes. So they were whipped for their attempt to revolt against the sailors and the captain and all the individuals who were part of the slave trading voyage on the Unity. 4 days later, on June 26th, we learned that, quote, a few of the slaves got off their handcuffs and were detected in time. So again, they got out of the handcuffs, but before they could take up arms, they were detected and the revolt was quelled. But why she uses this story is because you see consistently, it's not the lies that we have been told. From the moment these people got on the ship, they were revolting and trying to escape the ship. And there were women, in this case, we know at least 8 who were involved in the rebellions. Remember, there were 3 attempts and they were soundly punished and several of them died. And so it's important for us to recover those stories, that it's not just men who were leading these revolts, but often women who had access to certain areas, who, if God forbid, they were a victim of sexual assault, sometimes they got the key. That's how they were able to get out of their handcuffs. There were all kinds of things that they were doing, using their ingenuity to help bring about slave revolt on the ship. So I want to open up for discussion, but I want to just break here and talk about this idea of living in the wake of slavery. And so she writes, living in the wake of slavery is haunting. This is Rebecca Hall. And to experience the haunting is to be nothing less than traumatized. And what she's saying is that we need to understand not just the historian who has to read these harrowing accounts of slavery, of punishment, of sexual violence, of other kinds of violence, that it plays on our psyches, right? When we have to study it for our comprehensive exams, it plays on our psyches. To think that we can read that and not be traumatized is a fallacy. Yet, she says we have to tell their stories. Even in the face of this trauma, we have to tell their stories. To ignore them, we cannot. To pretend that they were not there, we cannot, right? And she says it's like as a wake, right? And we know what a wake is. It's a funeral, right? We speak of the dead and for the dead. And so what we need to do as scholars and as people who are descendants of those individuals is we have to speak for our ancestors. We have to hold a wake for them. We have to acknowledge their suffering, their trauma, and we have to give voice to the voiceless. At this wake, and she says this at the bottom on the right, we must defend the dead, defend the things that they did that may seem horrific, killing other people to get their freedom. We have to defend that. They were taken against their will. They were enslaved against their will. No one wanted to be enslaved. And so they had to do whatever they could do to get that freedom. Our memories must be longer than our lifetimes. What does that mean? We have to pass it on to the generations. We have to tell the young people what happened. We can't erase history because someone might feel, quote, hurt or guilty. It's not about assigning guilt. It's not about making someone feel uncomfortable. It is about speaking for the dead. It's about holding a wake for those people who didn't have a wake, for our ancestors who literally died either on the Middle Passage in enslavement or died in slavery, who didn't have the wake that they deserved, where we attest to their sacrifices that allow us to be here today. And so this is a powerful book. And I want to end with this. This is from the beginning of the book, In Unity, where they're talking about they're sending the signal. For our signal, Adono, you know we will die here. And Adono says to Alalele, we are already dead. At least let us die together. And then they hug and say in unity, and they lead the revolt. So thank you. I got just in time to open up for questions and to further discuss the book.
Wow, wow, wow. So, audience, if you did not know why Dr. Jeannette Eileen Jones-Phesenski was selected, now you know.
Thank you.
Her passion gave me chills, and I hope that you were moved by it as well. And if you did not read the novel, I hope that you were inspired to do so. I'm going to start off with questions. My question before or while the others, oh, they're coming in. They're coming in. My question is, what was you can only pick one, Dr. Jones-Phesenski, what was your favorite part of the book?
So my favorite part of the book actually is the slave rebellion in New York City. And I'm going to say, because I was born in New York City, but not in Manhattan, in Queensboro. And I did not remember learning about, I learned it in graduate school, but I didn't remember learning about the slave rebellions when we did New York State history. Like, I know we did. I did not know how prevalent slavery was in New York, and that New York City was a slave trading harbor. They never taught us that, right? And that people had lived until, New York abolished slavery after the Revolutionary War, that people had lived in slavery for generations in New York, because we had been taught that for the most part, slavery was a Southern thing. And I like the way that Professor Hall moves between the archives in New York, the municipal archives, New York State Historical Society, and then reimagining what happened in 1712. And I like that connection between past and, she's also from New York City, past and present, right? And then this homage to the future. Like, how do we grapple with this, particularly not just as historians, but as New Yorkers who were never told this history? And we are, I'm in my 50s and wasn't told that history as a child and had to learn it in higher education. And there's something wrong about that when it's fundamental to the history of New York City. So that was my favorite part.
Okay. Do you know what inspired the art style for the illustrations? The illustrations were amazing, actually.
Yeah, so Hugo Martinez is the artist, and he's done other work. And I think he was trying to use a kind of, he does comics, right? He's based in New Orleans. And he also writes about identity, resilience, and struggle. And I think what he was trying to do is make sure that those characters look as if they would have. Remember, they're either first generation African Americans or they were born in Africa. And so they would have a particular look, a particular dress. They would not have been deculturalized as we would think, that they would still hold on to some aspects of their culture, like covering their head or the hairstyles and the like. And so he was trying to really capture that in the depiction of the women. But I also like the way he decides to illustrate the primary sources so that you can see how they would have been written in the 18th century, like the Lloyds of London and all these other things that are so iconic in Liverpool, but also for you to get the sense of how it cuts against the violence that is attendant to slavery. So you have all this flowery, proclamations and beautiful calligraphy, and underneath that is just this violent system. And I think he plays with that well.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Let's see. Kathy J. Trotter says hello and awesome presentation.
Hi.
What was the website for the slave information?
So there are several websites. Her website is called the Ida B. Wells Project, and that's where you can get the transcript that I showed for the Dome one about Abigail and Tom. And if you go there, there's other sources. So what she did is she took a picture of the sources, whether she was in the archives in New York. She also went to archives in Great Britain, because that would be the most important one for the story of New York City. And then also the Slave Coast one. And what she did is she put those in there and did some transcription, so you don't have to try to read that handwriting because it's kind of weird. You may not be able to read it. And then the Smithsonian and, the National African American Museum of History and Culture is part of the Smithsonian complex. And so they also have a site that you can access some of those teaching materials. And I think that's important as well, so that you can use that to help, like if you're teaching this novel, to have students look at some of the primary sources, but also see how it's being depicted and illustrated by Martinez in the novel with Hall's narration.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful.
Do you know how long it took for her to go through the archives?
She said several years. I don't know the exact years, but I will say that maybe all of the archives, I feel like it was probably 4 to 5 years. Because particularly if anyone's been to NARA, I've been to NARA several times. This is the TNA, the National Archives in Kew, which is in London, and that's where you get all that Lloyds of London stuff. But you also can go to Liverpool, so you can get the Royal African Company stuff. Like, to go through all of that will take you more than a week, right? Like, if you're really being meticulous. And because she wanted to read between the lines, she actually started reading like any account, any ship's log, seeing how many women were aboard, because all ships had to say how many women, how many men, how many children, and then of the children, what their sexes were, male or female. And so all of that information is compiled. And then if you start hearing about the revolts, and then how many people were embarked versus how many people were disembarked, there might be, maybe 100 people missing. Usually there's misadventure. Somebody's been killed, there was a revolt, something's going on, or people die from starvation and hunger. And so going through all of that to find these hidden stories would take some time. And of course, the same thing with New York. I mean, when I was in college, I knew about the slave revolt in 1712, but the ways in which she brings to the fore the women who are not in, for instance, some of those books that were written in the 80s and 90s is important. because she did the research. She went there and said, let me re-examine the same documents that these iconic historians have, and let me find the women that are missing. So I know it took a lot of time to actually do the archival work, but also to put it together. So yeah, but I don't know the exact years, but I would venture the entire thing, probably 4 to 5 years.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of comments. You can hear the passion in Jeanette's voice. The pictures are so detailed. Do you have a favorite page in the book?
My favorite page in the book is probably page, I think that was the last one, where she's talking about the wake. So I believe that is page 194 through 195, where she's sitting in a kneeling position and she's talking about living in the wake of slavery. And then you see all the ancestors behind her. I can show that picture again. Would that be,
Okay.
This picture gives me chills because you see the ancestors, and just like, and she's in the middle because you see her with her dreads, right? And
Yes.
and she has her hands over her heart. You know, it's not the Wakanda, so it's not the Wakanda, but you know, and she's just sitting in that moment, and she's trying to like channel what it means to be a descendant of these people who were so brave, our ancestors who were so brave in the face of just things we can never imagine. And when I first saw it, I literally got chills because I was like, that we got to remember that's our people. That's like, that's our, and even if you're not Black, that's our history. That's the history of the United States of America. You know what I mean? That's the history of the colonies. We need to know that history. We need to grapple with it, and we need to have the wake for the dead. So that is my favorite one. It's really the one on 195. I like the other one, but not 195 is my favorite.
Okay, thank you. And another question is, how long did it take to get this type of degree? They don't specify if they're referencing you, but both you and the author have PhD. So
yeah, it you know, the historians typically, they say, and I see some other historians on there. My colleague Laura Munoz, Lara, you know, usually they say 6 to 7 years. It really depends on where you have to do the archival research. There's usually about 3 years of coursework. That's the coursework, and then the intense comprehensive exams where you got to learn all this history. And then you go out and do your research, and it depends on if your research is domestic, sometimes or international. So some people take 5 to 6 years, but they say that the average PhD, I believe, is 6 to 7 years from start to finish, right?
okay.
It's a hard thing.
Thank you. What part of this history did you find most surprising?
I knew, like I said, I knew about the Unity revolts, and I knew about Captain Norris. Captain Robert Norris is also important because eventually he's called before the British Parliament regarding the Brooks case, which, if anybody's seen a sketch of a slave ship where the people are literally packed like sardines, that is the Brooks case. And he used his logs to talk about the inhumane, I mean, he's a captain, the inhumane treatment of enslaved people aboard these slave ships. Long story short, the British didn't end slavery or the slave trade. In 1788, they created a regulation about how many people could be enslaved on a ship based on the ship tonnage. Also, that every ship had to have a surgeon on it in case someone got sick, and that the surgeon had to keep a log as well as the captain. And so Robert Norris, I mean, was an important figure. I did not know how important women were to the logs that he kept about these revolts. I knew they happened, but I did not know the extent to which women were at the center of these attempted revolts. So that was surprising to me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. We really, really appreciate you joining Metropolitan Community College once again. Audience, please watch for and connect to a link and a slide to an online evaluation for today's event. which will be posted in the chat. And please use your reactions to give it up for Dr. Jones-Wazanski. Once again, we know that you could have been doing many, many things, and we're so grateful and happy that you joined us this evening. Thank you once again, Dr. Jones-Wazanski. Thank you, tech team. And most of all, thank you, guests, for being with us this evening. Do you have any parting comments, Dr. Jones-Wazanski?
Yes, first of all, thank you again for having me this evening. And I just want to say that this was really a labor of love by Rebecca Hall. And I think it's important to understand the kinds of emotions that goes into writing these types of difficult histories, as we like to call them. And I just encourage you all to read Wake, and also when people, for those of you who have children, and even if you don't have children, if you see that there's an attempt to suppress this book, like they did Mouse, which was about the Holocaust, that you write to our school boards, and that you write to our politicians and explain why this is American history and why this history deserves to be told, and that we need to honor those who came before us. So I really thank you again, Dr. Gooch Grayson, for allowing me to share my thoughts about this book and what I think it means for us today. And have a great night, everybody.
Oh, I have one more question.
Yes.
Sorry about that. When you were talking, it came to mind. How did you like the use of the graphic novel to tell the story? And do you think that more stories should be told? Do you think it increases, we can reach a wider audience doing with that strategy?
I really think so. And I think, there's been a couple of attempts to do that. And of course, the most famous was Mouse, which is about the Holocaust. And then they also have the graphic novel about Anne Frank, but there's others. And I think, and then of course, there's some books about Rosa Parks and about Nikki Giamatti. It's not a graphic novel, but she did a book about Rosa Parks. And I think it's really important for that, because sometimes, and I say this as a historian, no shade on us, but that our words are so verbose and we're doing too much and we're missing, we're writing to other historians instead of writing to the public. Does that make sense? And
Yes.
We need to be more attendant. And I think that's why I said it was a labor of love, because she could have just wrote a regular monograph. She said, no, I want something that is going to catch the eye, but also is available to the public so that you can read it and you don't have to know all kinds of crazy theories to understand what's going on. And so, I urge anyone who is interested in any histories like this, if you want to work with a graphic novelist to do that, to really step out. And I could see wonderful histories about just Lincoln, Nebraska, and the community, or Omaha and Lincoln and Black people in Nebraska, that could really help us teach our students in the state about our history through a graphic novel approach. And I think it is a very good way to reach people who don't want to read a 200-page book. So
thank you. I have one more comment. Thank you for filling in some of the gaps in the history of our country. That was from one of the audience members. Thank you so much. It was my pleasure. And like I said, there's so much more that we don't know, or as an American public. And I hope that we can do more things in our communities to bring these histories to light. Thank you. With that, I bid you good night, everyone, and thank you for joining, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Thank you. Thanks. Good evening. Bye. Bye-bye, everyone.